morning. Today we're going to talk about lines and shape, and we're going to talk about balance and cohesiveness for a repeating pattern. Because what we're going to eventually do is put a repeating pattern on our coil pot. So we're going to kind of start prepping for this design, but in order to do that, we need to create what I like to call a line inventory and a shape inventory. And once you have that, you can make pretty much any repeating pattern that comes to you. And I think even on my sweater, so like this is a repeating pattern, but it looks really complicated, but we could break this down into basic shapes and basic line. And that's what I really try to get young artists to understand. Any type of painting, any type of drawing, any type of pattern work, any type of design is really broken down into those really, really simple elements. And if you understand that, you'll start to see art really differently, and I think you'll really enjoy it. So let's go ahead and get started. You need your sketchbook, a pencil, and all right, guys, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to start in your sketchbook with a fresh page, and we're going to create what we like to call a line inventory. So, a line and shape inventory. And what that's going to do is going to set you up to create a really nice repeating pattern. And I'm going to go through the process in, pretty big detail to help you understand how to get a good repeating pattern and how to break it down so you understand it in a really simple way. So in order to do that, we're going to start with lines. So I want you to think about, just the really basic lines that maybe that you drew in like elementary school. So what's the most basic line that we know of? A straight line. So a straight line is going to be that most basic, fundamental line that we could possibly have. And you can use that in a repeating pattern and it becomes really effective. Another one that's pretty simple that most kids have a pretty easy time of drawing is kind of like this zigzag line. And these days, some people call it a chevron, which I don't even know where that came from, and it drives me crazy. So we're going to stick with the classic zigzag. And then we have another really simple line. It's just a dash. So a dashed line. And take your time and draw these in your book really nice because these are going to be your reference for your repeating pattern. And then we have this loop-de-loop line. And we'll go into more detail in regards to how can you change the shapes of these lines and how that changes the effect. But for now, we're just staying pretty straightforward. Here's one, I don't really know what you would call it. I kind of like to call it the W line, or it sort of reminds me of like the upside down, like heartbeat line. But you could make up your own lines, really, if you wanted to. But we're just kind of doing the most basic. So then we have the scalloped line. So some people get this one and the loop-de-looped confused, and you can do a scalloped line so it's underneath, or you could do it so it's top side. I know it's really cool as you're going to kind of start to see some shapes within each of these lines, but we're going to, as an artist, that becomes, you start to see those things, but for you, just focus on the individual lines itself. Sometimes kids forget that dots or circles can become a line if you start to combine them. So if we did a row of circles, technically that could become a line. And you could fill these in if you wanted to, but I'm just going to keep them circles for effect here on our video. And I think it was Matisse that said a dot is just a line that took a walk. So you make a dot, make your line. So it's a dot that took a walk. Here's kind of like a wave, I guess. It's kind of like a version of the scalloped line, really. It's just you don't have such a stark angle there. And then from there, the kids and students and young artists always like to actually make a wave. And that's great. That is definitely a line that you could use in your artwork. We have the classic castle line. Everybody remembers that from elementary school. And you could make your castle line as tall or skinny as you want. And I call this the S line. So I'll go kind of slow so you can see it, but it's a version of the loop-de-loop, but you're gonna have one loop on top, and then the second loop is gonna be on the bottom. So we're gonna make a loop, and then a loop on the bottom. Loop on top, loop on bottom. And it takes a little bit of practice, but once you get into the rhythm of it, it becomes pretty easy. It also reminds me of kind of like a cursive S. And then we have another version of the scalloped line. We're just gonna add a couple more little bumps in here. So a big one, then a small one. Big one, then small one. And you just repeat that. It's kind of like a repeating pattern within the line. I like to call the next line I call it the picnic table line. So I'm going to do a triangle. I'm going to move back to the left. I'm going to make an angle line to the right and back down. So again, I like to call it the picnic table line. Go slow until you get into a rhythm. So up into a triangle, back to the left, back to the right. And I've ran out of room, so I'm going to go to the next page. And I'm using a Sharpie so you guys can see it on the video, but it did get on my next page. So the next one, I kind of call it like the swirly line, so we're just connecting some swirls. So I'm going to make a curved line like so, and then I'm going to loop it up on the bottom. And then the next one is going to go the opposite direction. So my curve is going to go up, and I'm going to loop. And we simply repeat that over and over again. But you want to make sure that it is connected at the point where you are creating the second section of the line. So don't leave them separate, because we want it to look like a complete line. I mean, in design, you could leave a space if you wanted to, but because we want these to look like ever-flowing infinity lines, we want to make sure that they're connecting. And there we go. And again, you could change the shape and the size of these if you wanted. And then one last kind of line that just is very simple to do is just straight lines that are not connected, but look as though they are one flowing section of a piece of artwork. Okay, so you can continue your inventory of lines. You could add a whole bunch more, but that gives you a good starting point. So now we're going to jump into basic shapes. So we've got our lines, so now we're going to do shapes. Now I want you to think of shapes that you used in elementary school. So we don't need our fancy schmancy geometry style shapes. We just want those really, really basic ones. So I'm talking about a square, a circle, a triangle, a diamond, a rectangle, an oval, a teardrop, and we could even go as far, it's a little bit more complicated, but we could get into the horseshoe shape. What we do not want to use in our repeating patterns are hearts, or stars, or peace signs. These are no good. Are they good for other sorts of things? Absolutely. But we are not going to use these designs for high school artwork. No way. And if you're watching this and you're not in high school, but you're just learning how to make a really good repeating pattern, I would still stay away from this. They're good for other things, but they're not good for quality repeating patterns. So now that we have our line inventory and our shape inventory, we're going to jump into setting up a grid so you have equal space and good balance to create a cohesive design. So grab your ruler and a pencil and keep your sketchbook out because we're going to need it. So in this section of the video, we're going to talk about how do you prep your notebook, your sketchbook, to create a good repeating pattern. So we're going to turn our paper so we are landscape, because before we were portrait and it just doesn't give us enough room. So the other tools that you'll need, which we kind of talked about, is your ruler and a pencil. I prefer a regular number 2 pencil, but if all you have is a mechanical pencil, that's perfectly fine. So your sketchbook, a ruler, and a pencil, and probably an eraser if you feel like you're going to need that. But we're going to set up our paper so we have a really nice grid so we can have equal space and balance to create a good cohesive pattern. So I'm going to drop my ruler down from the seam of my notebook, probably about a 1/2 inch to 1 inch, and I'm simply going to trace the side of my ruler and create a straight line on the top and do the same thing on the bottom. So you should just have 2 lines on your notebook, and then we're going to place our ruler right underneath that second line that we drew, and we're going to create 3 lines. So I have 3 lines on my notebook right now, and now what we're going to do is we're going to create a 1-inch block across, a 2-inch block across our paper. 1 inch would be too small. You could do 1 inch, but then your shapes and your lines are going to be really tiny. And I think for beginners, a bigger space is better. So 2-inch spacing all the way across the top line and a 2-inch spacing across the bottom line. And you're not going to be able to use this space right here because it's just a little bit too small, but that's okay. So now we're going to connect our lines. So when you're done with this, you should have squares going across your page. And this is going to allow you to have a repeating pattern that is equally spaced and balanced. So if you have something like this at the end, don't worry about that. You can just kind of shade it in as a reminder that you're not really using it. Or you could erase it all the way if you want to. So the other thing we need to do is we need to find the middle of our boxes. So technically, you could do this 2 different ways. You could just create an X from corner to corner and do the same thing on the other side so you have a line. But when you do that, then it gets confusing when you start to add your other shapes. So instead, because I know this is a 2-inch box, I'm just going to put a little mark in the middle telling me that's the middle. So I'm just using my 1-inch mark. And if you don't like to go all the way across the ruler, you can move the ruler like this to make your mark as well. But because it's a simple measurement, you probably don't need to do that. So now we know where the middle of our grid is. So at this point, we're going to start adding our basic lines and our basic shapes. So to create a good repeating pattern, what I want you to do is I want you to add 2 lines and 2 shapes. If you do that, you're going to get something pretty detailed that you never thought you could do. So before we go any further, I'm going to outline my grid so you can see it just a little bit better. Now that we have our grid set up, we're going to start adding lines and shapes. And I think for beginners, the easiest way to do this is to always start in the middle and work your way out. And whatever you do to one box, you're going to do all the way across in order to create that good repeating pattern. So we already have our line inventory. So you can use that to reference and to pick out whatever shape you want to use and whatever line you want to use. If you want to do this first one with me, that is perfectly fine. Or if you just want to watch, that's okay too. So I'm going to start with just a dot in the middle. So I've already kind of got that mark. So I'm just going to make that a little bit bigger. And I want to try to make it exactly the same. So if you have a stencil of basic shapes, this would be a great opportunity to use it. But you don't want to get sloppy. So we don't want to see like real crazy work happening. You got to concentrate a little bit to try to get these looking exactly the same. So this one's a little bit bigger. So I'll just add a little bit of width to each of these. And every time you add something, you know, after you're done, stop and take a look at it. And hopefully, you know, it doesn't have to be exactly the same, but you want to get it pretty close. So staying with kind of my organic shapes that I have, so anything organic is going to be round. We kind of refer to it from nature. So I'm going to stick with this idea, and I'm going to put another circle around the little dot that I made. Now, if you're going to do any circles, you really got to kind of pay attention. So I'm going to pay attention to the width from the edge of the dot to where the line is to create the circle. And if you want, you could measure it. So if you want to get super accurate, this is about 3/8. So then I could come over here and I could give myself a little dot, and I could do that all the way around, and that would be really, really accurate. Or, like I said, if you've got a stencil, you could do it that way as well. So notice that I'm not getting in a hurry. I'm drawing relatively slow. And this is why you want to do this with a pencil. That way if you mess up, you can erase it. So they're a little bit off. Like this one's a little bit closer on this side, but for the most part, they're the same. And now, sticking again with my circles, I'm going to put one on each side, on top and bottom. So remember, I need to use two different shapes, and currently I only have circles on my design, and I need to use two. So eventually I'm going to have to pick another shape to add to this repeating pattern. So I'm going to take a look at my shape inventory, and I'm going to decide what shape is going to match kind of the design that I have going on right now. So I've added my circles across my page, and remember, whatever I do to one box, I'm going to do all the way across, and that's what's going to help you keep a really consistent repeating pattern. So I need to go ahead and add a second shape, because right now I have just used a circle, and so I really need something else in here to give it a little bit more flair. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my grid to my advantage, and I'm going to put a triangle that's going to connect these pieces. So because I have my ruler handy, I'm going to use it. That way my pattern stays nice, crisp, and sharp. So I'm going to go from this line to the corner, and I'm going to do this all the way across. I'm not inside my boxes now, I'm in between the boxes, but I'm still using the grid to my advantage to help me keep this really balanced. And remember, that is one of the principles of art that we're trying to use. And if you do that and you keep your design balanced, then it's going to automatically look cohesive. This is a really cool trick that I want to show you guys. If you have just a single line, whether it's just a basic line or you're doing a shape, either way, something cool that will help it look just like it sticks out just a little bit more, or will give it more of a three-dimensional effect, is if you just simply take that same line and you repeat it. So either up here behind the circle, or you could even do it on the inside here. So I'm just going to kind of lightly put that on there and see which one I like. And to be quite honest, I like it both ways. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add that line on the inside of my diamond and on the outside. But before I do that, I want to make sure that it's as balanced out as possible. So I'm just going to kind of eyeball, and you could measure this if you wanted to. I'm just going to kind of eyeball where I think those lines are going to go. And then I'm going to use my ruler to help me as a guide. start a really good repeating pattern, and all we have used is a circle and a diamond. That is it. That's all we've used. So we need to give it just a little bit more pop, but because remember I said you needed to use 2 lines and 2 shapes, and currently we only have 1 of each. So I'm going to keep going, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a second or an additional line down here at the bottom. I probably should measure that, but that's okay. And then I'm going to add one at the top. And this is going to act as a border for me for my actual repeating pattern, and I'm going to be able to get my lines by adding this. So I'm going to look at my inventory of lines, and I'm going to decide which line I like and which one kind of goes with the design that I already have started. And I think that I'm going to try and do this picnic table line. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to drop this line down, because I need to make sure that I have equal spacing. So if I do the picnic table line 3 times in this box, then I need to make sure I'm doing it 3 times in this box. So I'm going to turn my page just a little bit. And in order to do that, I think what I'll do is I'll mark where, see, that's going to be too far apart. I guess I could measure this. So let's see. I'm just going to kind of mockily draw it on here so I can get the spacing right. And then I'm going to go back in and I can add this part. Ooh, I like the way that looks, actually. So I know that I have 3 of these, so I need to try and do that in this box as well. And our goal is to try to get it balanced out and evenly spaced. And I'm going to keep that up going all the way across my page. I have a design that is really starting to come together. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to check off my 2 shapes and I'm going to work on my next line. So I can go ahead and check this one off. Even though I changed it just a little bit, it's still the same process. So I made it a little bit more 3-dimensional by adding this element of shading, but it still counts as a line. So now I have to decide, okay, where do I want to put my second line without making it look a little bit too crazy? And I want to think about the shapes that I already have in there. I already placed my grid on the paper, filled in with some ovals that had points on either side, and now I'm just creating a band at the top of the bottom of my pattern. I wanted to create a design that had 2 lines and 2 shapes, and in order to do that, I continued to add elements within the pattern on top and bottom and in the middle. So I finished my second design, and for my lines I used like this reverse swirl, kind of curly Q, a straight line. I didn't want to add another complicated line because I thought it would make it look too messy. So I just added a second band here, and I think it will just give it some clarification. And you could add those in different sizes and you can get a really cool effect. And then for my shapes, I used a circle and an oval, and I just changed the oval just slightly. I just altered it and put it so it had just a slight point at either end to create these ellipses designs up here. So at this point, if it makes you feel better and you want to go ahead, because you want to be able to see your design just a little bit better, if you want to erase the grid marks, you could absolutely do that. It's not necessary, but you can if you're a visual person and you really need to be able to see it. You could leave it, but I would leave it at least on one of your boxes. That way you have it as a guide when you transfer this onto your coil pot. So for your assignment, you guys are doing 2 different patterns. So you would have something looking like this in your sketchbook. So here's my first design, and I've listed my lines that I used and my shapes that I've used. And then here's my second design with my lines and my shapes. I think you'll have a really good time when you're doing this. Put some music on and just kind of let your mind flow. Use those line inventories and those shape inventories as your guide, and make it the best that you can. If you have stencils, you can absolutely use those. And just remember, whatever you do to one box, you're going to do it all the way across. Try to keep it as balanced and equally spaced as you possibly can, and most importantly, have fun with this assignment. I'll talk to you soon.